Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Robyn Braverman, who will be speaking to us today on can youth reduce their risk in joining a gang if their families are stronger? A 4-year U.S. government-funded project in Honduras says yes. I am Alexandra Hernandez Pardo, your ICFRC interim co-director and host for today's program. As always, we thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible. I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa's honors program, the University of Iowa's Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And I thank today's special sponsors, Alan Swanson with Blank & McCune Realty, Derek and Pamitha Willard. I also thank City Channel 4 for helping us to continue to make our programs available to online audiences. Today, we will have another online program, and I think you'll find the format similar to our typical lunch programs. Following our speaker's presentation at about 1 p.m., we will have a 15-minute Q&A. Please submit your questions via the chat function on Zoom, which you can access by clicking on the chat box icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Our speaker will answer questions submitted by chat. For those of you watching on Facebook, you can submit your questions via comment, and we will do our best to monitor these as well. As a final reminder, I ask that you please keep your audio and video turned off for the duration of the presentation, and do not disrupt the speaker. If you experience technical difficulties, please refer to support.zoom.us for user guides and other support. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Robyn Braverman. Robyn Braverman is a proven leader with more than 30 years of experience in international development. She has worked directly in a developing country context, including in Honduras, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Haiti, and Cuba for more than 20 years. She has provided technical leadership and overall management of complex youth development and violence prevention programs in Central America and the Caribbean, and is a trusted leader. Ms. Braverman has repeatedly demonstrated her ability to establish partnerships and manage successful working relationships with a range of key stakeholders, including senior government counterparts, donor representatives, private sector, and civil society partners. In the wake of Hurricane Mitch, Ms. Braverman led USAID's $20 million reconstruction efforts, where she oversaw a multi-pronged approach to reduce gang-related violence and promote youth development in high-crime communities by rehabilitating schools, community institutions, health clinics, and policed outposts in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. In Guatemala and Honduras, she oversaw the creation of community policing programs and built local capacity to understand the laws governing juvenile justice and child protection. In Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Ms. Braverman managed complex violence prevention portfolios. She is considered an expert in the field of youth development and violence reduction. Please join me in welcoming Robyn Braverman.
Thank you. And it's great to be back in Iowa City, albeit sheltered. For those of you who don't know me, you may know my family. So without further ado, I will just, again, thank you for staying safe, sheltering in place, and hopefully washing your hands a lot. I think we've all spent a lot of time in doubt recently and looking for some rays of hope. So hopefully, what we were able to do in Honduras will give you a ray of hope. I really want to frame this by saying that this project was a result of the 2014 occurrence of thousands of children arriving at the US border unaccompanied. The Obama administration really looking at what were the tasks at hand and how to really create something that was developmentally based in order to reduce the number of children in particular migrating. And when we ask ourselves the question, why do kids migrate, we often tend to not look at the more systemic reasons. And for that reason, the Obama administration decided to take a look at the deeper systemic reasons and came up with what they are known as the place-based approach, a manner of directing foreign aid into, in this case, high crime areas, and looking at a multi-pronged approach to create local investment, create an opportunity for services, and hopefully mitigate some of the factors that we know promote violence. And what I was asked to do was lead a very large portfolio over, at first, 3 years to look at how we can use families and strengthen families as part of the place-based approach. What we did was we took a model that was loosely based on the GRID model in Los Angeles that looked at how to create a framework of service provision with the municipalities in order to reduce kids' risks of going into gangs. Now, that being said, what was the model in Los Angeles has nothing to do with what the model looked like in Honduras, but it was a framework that the US government thought was relevant. So can you move forward with the slides, please? Next slide. Sorry, so what we did was, that's great. Just, this is what we were tasked with doing were 5 things, but I'm gonna really focus on the key one, which was creating a cadre of family counselors who worked with kids who were at the door of joining a gang. And when I say this, I mean that we're not just working with an index child, but really looking how to build the family as the key protective mechanism. And what we began with the premise is that if we can shift the choreography of the dynamic of the family, we can really build a stronger network that a child feels reflected in, and in doing so reduces their risk levels. Now, how we did that, next slide, please. These are some of the quotes from some of the families who have been part of the program, but I want to move forward because I'm cognizant of time. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what are we? You know, go back one, sorry. Thank you. We're a 4-year program, started out as a 3-year program, $25 million from a contract within USAID called Youth Power. And it's looking at really shifting the focus on how we are increasing and empowering youth to become more active and less and more resilient to risks. So one of the results, which I'm going to talk about, is how kids are receiving secondary prevention services. The second result is support services for those kids and their families. The third result was really building a human resource capacity to respond to that need, because in Honduras, there were no family counselors. There were traditional psychologists, not very many psychiatrists. There were nurses and social workers, but you looked at using a model developed by the Mnuchin Family Institute, and it's a 7-phased approach to looking at how we respond to doing family counseling. The fourth result was looking at how we could also look at the issue of juvenile justice, how we could reduce the number of kids in detention centers, which are basically nesting grounds for recruitment and strengthening of gangs. And then 5, really, how are we establishing this model and what does that look like? Because in a lot of contexts, you know, a lot of these contractors you know, come in, they do their work and they leave, and they don't leave anything substantiated in the communities or in the human resource capacity. So what I'm going to do is take you through really result 1 and 5, and because these are really key components, and the majority of our work was really focused on how to find family counselors, train family counselors, use a calibrated tool to use as a baseline to identify risk factors. And when I talk about risk factors, it means that if you are at a primary risk level as a kid, It means that you really have a minimal level of risk of joining a gang because the protective mechanisms in your family, in your communities are very strong, and you know how to access those resources. If you're at a secondary level, it means you have a number of risk factors that you have self-responded to. That means you are at the door of joining a gang or engaging in illicit activity, and that puts you at a secondary level of risk. If you are at a tertiary level, and again, this is a self-responded survey that kids take in the beginning, that means that you've already engaged in some sort of illicit activity, whether it be in a gang, whether it be being a drug runner, but you self-identify with that. And when I talk about this population, I'm only talking about populations who have voluntarily agreed to be part of this project. So what I want to do is kind of take you through the steps, but first I want to talk about the tool that we use to identify risk and how we found these kids. USAID tasked us through the place-based strategy with only working in 5 urban communities in Honduras where there was the highest level of homicide rates and the highest presence of gangs. And when we talk about gangs, I want you to be clear that people live in small, overly populated neighborhoods in an urban area where gangs have wrestled control because there is an absence of protective services, police, quality education, health. What exists generally are some sort of spiritual access to churches, access to some community centers, but generally they are controlled and you have a dynamic with a gang, and the leaders of those gangs own specific territories within which you have to ask permission to go in and work. So within that, you know, people have lived in what we would call a chronic state of fear, because if you have a small business in these communities, you have to pay a bribe in order to stay open, and that's generally based on a set price that the gangs will assign to you depending on the size of your business, and is collected either at a weekly or monthly interval. And if you don't, what will happen is you will be threatened with violence or faced with violence. And then what you see inherently in Honduras right now is a very large degree of internal displacement. But the gangs basically have a strong enough network that they can follow you wherever you go. So that's the context in which we work. So we basically created a cadre of family counselors. We used a tool that was created by the University of Southern California and the City of Los Angeles that determines which kid is at risk level. And in order to do that, we had to create within our abilities a network of referrals. So we created a referral network with other churches or schools to really look at who could be referred to take this baseline. Now, this sounds difficult in any situation, but you're really asking kids really deep questions like, have you ever been in a gang? What's the presence of gang? What's your relationship to your school? How do you feel about your family? And based on those results, we worked with the National University of Honduras, and we calculated those results, and we were able to determine who was at a primary, secondary, and tertiary level. With that information, we obviously had to get permission from the parents or whoever the adult responsible in the family was to apply this baseline. And once it was approved and applied, we then went back and said, your family is available and eligible rather to be receive a family counseling model. Are you interested? Now, most of them said yes, although in the context of development, most people think that when you are offering a service, you also get something in return, some sort of subsidy. It could be financial, a food basket, but we offered nothing. We offered trained counselors. And what we had to do was really build the trust from the beginning to go in and let them open their houses to our counseling teams of 3 strategy teams to go in and really apply this model. Can you go to the next slide, please? Next slide. Okay. So what does it look like? This is our approach. You go back one. So what do? We do the initial risk assessment, which is what I talked about. And then the family participate in a 6-month intervention that includes 7 phases. A counselor provides the guidance to youth and their families through each of these phases. Then we go back at the end of the 6 months and we do a reevaluation. We apply the same baseline and we look at whether within the risk factors that exist, have the risks been reduced and have the protective mechanisms increased. And during the process of doing this, because as we are a contractor from the US government, we also have to have indicators to show what we are measuring. And we realized humbly that we were measuring a kid's risk, but we were doing a family intervention. So we really needed to find a tool to be able to give us the data to look at family cohesion and the strength of that as well. So simultaneously, when we're applying the baseline to the child, we're also applying a family cohesion tool called FACES to one of the responsible adults. And we reapply that as well. So we're able to look at, have we increased the family dynamic? Have we reduced the kids' risk factors? Have we created a strong enough family network to be able to ensure, hopefully, that this kid is at less risk of joining a gang than before? So that's the premise of what we do. However, what we also realized is that we really wanted to measure this in real time. Did it work? What didn't work? What would change? Because we had 4 years and 4 cohorts of families, which means we had to, after one group cohort was done, we went back and we did another one. We had to go back and find other kids at risk and go back to be able to look at, keeping this going. At the same time, we were working with Arizona State University to do a real-time quantitative evaluation of this model. And we also worked with looking at how to develop a qualitative evaluation of this model. We also wanted to say, with some sort of evidence, that there was a really good cost benefit engaged in all of this. So while we're actually in the field, we're working with a cadre of academics, both from Arizona State and locally, to look at the research, look at the data, and look at what we could offer as learning that would reinforce the model or ask us to make changes to make the model different. So that's generally what the model looked like. And this is what it looks like after 4 years of intervention. Can you go to the next one, please? Next slide. When we looked at this tool, this baseline tool, we really wanted to collect information, and this is a self-reporting information, and I will say that we worked with children from the ages of 8 to 17. And I know it's quite frightening to think that there were kids as young as 8 with the intention of joining a gang or working in some sort of illicit activity. Now, it's also worth noting when you think about this that gangs use minors because generally the sanctions against them, if they are caught by the law, are less than they would be attributed to an adult. So kids are really, really great prey for gang members. So we looked at antisocial tendencies, weak parental supervision, critical life events. What are the impulsive risk-taking? What's the neutralization of guilt? What are the negative peer influence factors? Delinquency, influence of gangs in the family, and crime and substance abuse. So if a youth scored at 4+ in the scale, she's identified as being at secondary or tertiary risk and eligible for family counseling. Next slide, please. Next slide. So then we say, okay, we're assigning Nobody ever talks to these families about, hey, your kid's at risk of joining a gang. We just say, we really want to find the positive qualities in your child, work with you to look at positive parenting, and reinforce those great qualities that your child has. We don't want to continue to stigmatize a kid who's already had behavior issues based on X, Y, and Z. So our approach was really looking at these 7 phases and and the counselors obviously working together as a strategic team to collaborate, monitor, and adjust each family's plan. Now, because we're guided by timeframes regulated by the donor, there was not a lot of flexibility in applying each of these timeframes for each of these phases. So obviously the first one I talked a lot about was how you get the referrals, how you collaborate, how you evaluate, what are the applications, what does phases tell you? The second phase is building agreements with the family. It's the first time the counselors go in, they kind of look at them, talk to them about what this really looks like. What does it look like for us to be in your space? How comfortable are you? This is what we hope to get out of it. And then the third is really looking at redefining a problem and a solution, because usually it could be, I don't like my daughter's boyfriend and he's a gang member and he's a minor and she's a minor and they never come home. And that is a really traditional behavior that I, Robyn Braverman, have done. I mean, not that my boyfriend was a gang member, but, I used to buck the trend a little bit as a kid. And in common reality, that is a fine thing to do in a stage of adolescence. In communities rife with crime and no real presence, as I've said before, of structures, that's a problem. So these become bigger in these communities. And then you see parents and children start to really identify where the quagmire is in these kinds of relationships and where those problems can come and what the solutions are. At that point, they're given certain tasks to do, how to build agreements, really basic things, y'all, like let's do a list of chores that you need to do before you can go out. Let's make sure that if you go out between the hours of 7 and 9. And that when you're at X person's house, you call me when you get home and I can tell you if the neighborhood is safe to come home to. So it's looking at that. And then building on that, we also look at what are the other family networks that are important to create that change. And what we found is that really strong elements of building what we call a genogram or a family tree and tracing back 3 generations is a way to really bring the family together. And it really brings up a lot of stories, looks at the dynamics and power dynamics and relationships, and even helps family rediscover other families. So that's also part of phase 3. Phase 4 is when we say, okay, let's come back together. And what have you accomplished together? And that's a chance for both the family and the youth individually to say, I realize that these are shifts in my behavior. I realize that my parents aren't always right. Whatever it is, we provide them with a very small stipend to have a change in their family. Create some sort of event for them that is reflective and celebratory. And usually such a small amount, it's like $25, that they go out and they buy food and they actually invite their extended family to celebrate and to bring together that sense of unity. Some people have started gardens, but some people have painted houses together, but most people use it as a chance to kind of go back through their family rituals. And what we found is that a lot of that ritual and storytelling has to do with recreating recipes. So as a sidelight to that, we actually created a recipe book of our families and interventions' favorite Honduran recipes and have given it back to them. And then we reintegrate. What does it look like to integrate? What is the next level that you have to go for before you actually are done with counseling? What do you still need to work on? And what can the counselors do to facilitate that? And then finally, the reevaluation. And at that point, we say, we've also noticed in phase 6 and phase 7 that there's a need to kind of really build a network of service delivery around some of these families. And some of it is taking them, helping them, pushing them to go back and being an advocate for their kids in school. being an advocate for, being a better leader in your community, working with some of the local services, linking them to other US government services around employability and all of that. So that's generally, and it's a 6-month program. And then once it's over, we take that data and we run it, and we are able to say with certainty that X% of our families in this intervention, they have children who have reduced their risk by X%. Okay, next slide. We also, when I was talking about, this is for the science nerds out there, when we did an evaluation, we also did a random control group. And one of the things that you realize is that as simple, if people who do this for a living more academically than me, this is a really common tool that you use. But in Central America, and especially around violence prevention, this has never been done before. So this is the first RCT that was ever done in the region. And it was stratified by 14 zones in 5 municipalities in Honduras. We assessed 4,495 kids, 944 youth at risk, which is the secondary and tertiary I talked about, and 463 assigned to the treatment group. After we used the treatment group and the control group, we assigned 481 to the control group, and then we went back and intervened and provided family counseling to them after 6 months. So balancing tests showed that the randomization was correct, and there was still some attrition at end line, but the groups are still pretty balanced. And I want to say that that's actually really interesting, dynamic for us to really look at, like, oh, wow, it actually worked, and what worked and what didn't work. And one of the things that we also came up with was, you can go to the next slide, was the evaluation said that there were direct effects, and that, the risk factors that we saw were, constant weak parental supervision, rebelliousness, antisocial tendencies, and impulsive risk-taking significantly had decreased for the treatment group. And among protective factors, opportunities for community pro-social involvement, opportunities for family pro-social involvement, interaction with pro-social peers, significantly increased for the treatment group as well. Now, this is really powerful. And what we also found was that, overall, family cohesion was really strengthened. There were some risk factors which we can't account for, which still existed, and that has a lot to do with the environment and the lack of other services that exist during the course of our work. And we honestly understand that in order for this to be effective, you really do need 4 legs of a table to stand on. You need, strong services. You need police around. You need to have that sense of feeling protected externally. Next. So improved family communication and family satisfaction, which led to a decrease in overall risk factors, reduced poor family management, family conflict, which led to a reduction in delinquency, increased family attachment. There were more opportunities for families for pro-social engagement. It really built their confidence as a unit. And family rewards for pro-social involvement and interaction with pro-social peers, which also led to a reduction in delinquency. I mean, we had kids say, wow, now I realize that John Doe really was a middle guy running drugs for the DAC Ocho gang, and I didn't really want to be with them because once I was engaged with it, I could see what the consequences of that behavior would be. And we had mothers say that they felt more empowered as an adult managing her role as an adult in this dynamic. Now, what I find, just as a tangent, really interesting is that what we didn't study until the very end, which I think is a learning, is the role of gender in all of this. I mean, we had some stats about differentiation between girls and boys at 8 and 17 in their pro-social involvement. But in terms of, did we shift any macho tendencies in the dynamic between, say, a mother and a husband, or a grandmother and her grandson. I'm sorry to say that we really didn't measure that. We really should have, and it's one thing that I've mentioned in my final report to the donor. Go ahead, next. So when we also realized that, you know, we're using all these numbers as quantitative, and we're using it, and we're not really going back and saying, well, did this really have any change in the long term on these families? And so we actually looked at, we did a qualitative evaluation, and we waited long enough so that the first cohort had been out for a year, the second 6 months, and so forth. And we went back and we wanted to assess whether what we say with scientific evidence was really manifesting in the family. And there's always a risk that, you know, you might not, you know. And so we did a random sample of the beneficiary program, in the programs, and we focused on the 4 aspects. Do they still have family cohesion? How's the communication? How's the supervision? And how is the structure of the family? And results really showed persistent improvements in family communication, supervision. And we realized that in the middle of this, as many of you may recall, I want to say July, August of 2019, there were lots of caravans leaving Honduras in a pretty public way, which prompted the President of the United States to really have a pretty harsh response to immigration and asylum. And what it did for us as a contractor with the US government was our donor was saying to us, well, what are you doing about immigration? How can you prove that you're reducing immigration? Well, you know, we really can't, but maybe we can, right? So this is where some of this stuff came up, that we can prove that if there is an anchoring in the community, that people feel stronger and more supported, particularly starting with the family, there's going to be a less of a potential to migrate. And now I can't say that with certainty, but going back to these families, we were able to ask these questions and prove that it can help mitigate effects of external environment, you know, gangs, violence, unhealthy peers, but I would also add migration. We have been able to see that kids have changed their attitudes, their grades are higher, they're more engaged in their school, partially because their parents are more engaged in their school, and they're more engaged in pro-social communication with their children, and that the children are also looking at kind of a cause and effect on their behavior. Next. Then we did a cost-benefit analysis because, you know, I don't know, we just felt like we should be able to say that was this a worthy thing. And so I'm just going to summarize that can you go back one? Sorry. We conducted a cost-benefit analysis to estimate the net present value of the program, and we indicated that it was cost-beneficial. And we're not saying that you take the total of the program and divide it by the number of families, but we're looking at a number of factors as well. And one of them was the actual homicide rate, the tendency for it to go down, and the tendency for it over time to stay the same. And so we were looking at a number of factors. So we found that the value of benefits ranging between US $4 to $5.4 million, a benefit cost ratio ranging from 1.2 to 1.4. Next. And to summarize, like, these really promote our theory. It does work. You can create that providing support to families with at-risk youth can really mitigate their overall level of risk. And we really believe that we have seen increased resilience in these families, and that the family counseling model can be used in a flexible way in different environments, maybe not with the highest rate of homicide, but it's a good way of really mitigating risks and increasing resilience. And they can bring about individual and family changes regardless of the complexity of where they are. And we are pretty much a good bang for the buck. Now, before I go on, I just want to say one more thing that I haven't talked about. And that's that while we were building this cadre of human resources counselors, we worked with the Catholic University of Honduras and the National University, and we created the first master's program in psychology and family counseling that has been approved by their Board of Education to be something that they offer in the future. So we've been able to graduate the first group of of psychology majors with a focus on family counseling. And that's a pretty huge step. And those people are working in ministries of education, ministries of health, and their community organizations, and really replicating the concepts of this model. At the same time, we worked with 2 local community organizations, and we transferred the family counseling model to them. One worked specifically with a voluntary population in a different community than we did, had similar results. The other only worked with kids who were referred to by the state juvenile justice system. And instead of going into detention, were given an alternative sanction to detention. Those results were less promising because we also realized that this model needed to have a level of flexibility to meet the needs of kids who had maybe left detention, were getting alternative sanctioning, or had just been engaged in the juvenile system and required other services as well. We also funded service delivery and worked with government entities to create these networks of service providers so that they can refer. So we feel like we've created this. We also funded a master's program at the National University of Honduras and gave scholarships to 25 justice operators on juvenile justice and child protection, because we felt that there was a separation of applying a sanction from the rights of the child. And that has really manifested itself in differentiation by juvenile judges and how they're adjudicating a case. Next. So, I want to show you a short video that we did. I hope you can read the subtitles, and then I think we can take some questions. We can't hear the sounds.
Proceso de consejería hay una serie de factores donde los jóvenes podrían como tomar malas decisiones. Entonces, al no contar con oportunidades educativas, formativas y espacios de recreación, en sus barrios, en sus colonias, se encuentran a la vuelta de la esquina con grupos que bajo las promesas de que vas a tener dinero, vas a tener ropa bonita, entonces los atraen a ellos y es cuando algunos de ellos se involucran. Pues los consejeros acompañamos a la familia durante un periodo de tiempo, en este caso son 6 meses. Durante este tiempo permitimos pues conocer de todas las personas y a partir de esa fortaleza estamos la consejería. Hemos visto cambios a través de la organización. Hemos visto familias que no se hablaban, familias que estaban involucradas en actos ilícitos, han como hecho un esfuerzo para mejorar sus condiciones de vida y decir, bueno, esto no es lo que yo quiero para mí. Y hemos visto también cómo los muchachos, como los jóvenes tienen esa necesidad de cambiar y de querer hacer las cosas diferentes. Yo he sentido un cambio en la verdad. He visto un cambio mucho. Yo no sabía, ¿verdad?, llevarme con mis hijos. no sabía, pero ya hoy que ellos están aquí a nosotros nos han ayudado mucho, mucho. Pensé que no venía, que viniera, porque puedan venir a dar consejos, ayudarme a portarme bien, no venir tarde, y hacer caso a mi papá. Mi familia han cambiado. De hecho, lo que yo quería, no me han dado lo que yo quería, yo los quiero mucho. Desde la primera reunión que tuvimos, él quedó motivado.
Okay, hello everyone. That would be the end. Is that correct?
That's correct. That just
Okay.
gives a little bit of a framework for what it's like to go into somebody's house and actually do this and see.
Yeah,
the
it was beautiful. It does give a nice visual for sure. So as you said, we're going to move to questions. I want to thank you, Robyn, so much. That is incredible work. And we're going to ask the audience to submit your questions via the chat function, as we've done in previous programs. You can access the chat function by clicking on the chat box icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Type your message in there and we will field questions. Again, for those of you watching on Facebook, you can leave your questions in the comments and we're going to try to include as many of those questions as possible. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I would like to mention that we have several upcoming programs in the process of being organized. We will send out our usual email announcements, but please also check our website for the latest updates on future online programs. In addition to that, we'd like to take a moment to thank those members of our community who are working in healthcare, delivery, or other essential businesses and services. These are uncertain times, but the work provided by these members of our community is essential to our ability to continue thriving. And with that, let's take a look. And I do apologize if you end up hearing my dogs. I have a couple dogs in the background that may have something to say as well. So nothing has come in yet. Let's just check the Facebook. So I did get a question via text from a person that I know that has been watching, and they're asking if there are any opportunities for volunteering or working with the organization, I guess, that you worked through.
Yes, there are. Not now, but
Yeah.
we worked with a number of local partners who would love to receive volunteers depending on your skill set. So yes, and I wanted to say one more thing. You know, we're still working. You know, we're still closing, but we just applied a national survey using the IMC tool to look at any patterns in immigration, you know, and risk on a national level. But we also just finished filming 8 training videos and 2 training manuals to be left in country so that this can be replicable by anyone. And I can send ICFRC the link that you can download any of the research. We've also done 71 pieces of research and publications on violence prevention and a family focus.
Wow.
And those are also available.
Okay, awesome. Anyone that is interested in that opportunity, just email icfrc@icfrc.org, and we can get that information from Robyn to you. I kind of a follow-up on that question, since we aren't seeing any other ones. You did kind of mention briefly experience. What is that experience? Could you expand on that a little bit in order to be able to volunteer or?
Well, I think like the concept of volunteering is pretty big, right? Like, do you have money? Do you expect a stipend? Have you lived overseas? Have you worked with youth at risk? And what can you offer? You know, a lot of times we're super excited about like being a volunteer, but then you end up, oops, sorry. I'm so sorry. This is completely unexpected. One second. One of the things that we notice is that when we get really excited about volunteering, you're ending up doing a lot of filing or Excel spreadsheets. So be really clear about what you can offer and what your expectation is, because, you know, I think this question comes up a lot for people who want to get into the development field in general. And so, you know, what is it? What are your basic skill sets and what do you expect versus what the reality is? And, you know, the reality is working in urban areas in Honduras. I mean, we've had some people who wanted to volunteer and really for security reasons, we couldn't really do it, but other local partners can. So it just depends on what you have to offer. And if it's a skill set that's relevant, and remember, we all love this idea of volunteering, but there's also a huge volunteer base in Honduras. And one of them was created by us. The people who received our master's programs, and also we did kind of a specialty program, made a commitment to create networks of professionals or alumni associations. And they're judges, they're professors, they're teachers, they're social workers, they're retired counselors. And they're going back to the communities and setting up free workshops on legal aid, on psychosocial support. And now with COVID, they've actually tried to use a platform that we created, which is an online service delivery program that we created to link georeference services to local communities, to use it to open up the platform to provide online counseling. We also did a project that I haven't talked anything about in this, and we did a pilot on trauma counseling. So we have a lot of expertise and also need and know that that expertise exists, but there's always great room and great ways to become engaged as a volunteer. I saw another question come up, but I didn't.
Yep, I can read that for you if you'd like.
Yeah.
So Natalia has asked, are there any lessons that you personally learned from Proponte Más from this project?
Oh yeah, a lot. It's such a great question. I learned a lot about how to be flexible in a management style. I had 3 field offices and 130 staff. I learned about really being patient and trying and testing out something that isn't always going to respond to a donor's time frame. I learned about like really vast differences in political administrations, to be quite honest. I learned a lot about pushing back. But what I learned most about, not just from a management, was how deeply powerful it is to work in a community. Well, we worked in, I think overall 35 neighborhoods in 5 municipalities where poverty is rampant, and urban poverty for me is just really painful. But I learned just to be so grateful to be let into somebody's house and to have them show us their level of vulnerability and their deep desire to change. So yeah, that was a big, powerful thing for me. And I think I learned that there is a huge beauty in merging science and social work.
Wow. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. So the next question is from Carrie Norton.
Oh, hi, Carrie.
Can you elaborate on the relationships with the university on setting up training programs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And let me tell you, it took a year, both with the Catholic University and the National University, of really sitting down and finding the right departments. We work with the Department of Psychology and Statistics, and the Catholic University has a very traditional family kind of counseling program. And it was really sitting down and creating this level and dynamic of what we can offer, what exists, and really recognizing that there is some existing capacity and trying to frame it in a different way. So we also worked with both those universities in promoting research on violence prevention and giving them money to create some forums around and debate around what's beneficial on a family systems model so that they could position themselves as well. And I think that was really helpful. But I think what I learned a lot was like really that patience and looking at how to create that dynamic and convince them, and then have them have enough evidence to convince their Board of Education that these are offerings that should be continued to be offered without outside funding. And we achieved that with the Catholic University. With the National University fraught with politics, the reason that we were able to support a master's program on juvenile justice is because it was funded by a Spanish university and by ourselves. Whether they will offer that again, despite the impact that it's had, it's really hard to tell. But I think despite that, the people who took that course and took that master's program have really changed the way that they do their service delivery. So for me, that's an added value. So patience, knowing the right people. I mean, we went round and round with the Ministry of Education and trying to identify key people and really trying to figure out who those decision makers are. And then finally, Carrie, I think that what was also important is that we created a curriculum committee made up of people from the National University, professors in statistics, psychology, and also with what we would know as like here it's like the Board of Medicine, there it's the College of Psychologists. And they're the people who do the accreditation of psychologists. So we worked with them and we really hammered out what the academic offerings would be. And what I didn't mention is that we not only have the master's programs in family systems, but we also offered different levels of specialization, what they call a diplomata course. And those were really geared towards lay workers in the community, people who were doing some promotional work and looking at setting up networks and social services, but didn't have the academic levels or educational levels that people who were aspiring for a master's degree had. So we were able to not only provide them with a diploma program, but also they got certified as psychologists by the Colegio de Psicólogos as well.
Awesome, thank you. Another question that came in, if you were to give this presentation to the US government, what would you recommend them change regarding foreign aid?
Oh, wow. So, you know, the way that aid works is that you actually create your strategy in country. And then based on that framework, which is approved by the USG and State Department, you get your tranche of money. And then those programs are kind of defined by obviously foreign policy. So some of it is really national. And I feel like we've inserted ourselves in the national development of the new strategy for USAID, which is very rare that they ask people like me to come in and help them define the strategy. However, given it's the government that is, not that what we want, I would say continue to look at really building that family lens and using evidence-based approaches. Now, I know probably within this group that the use of evidence is not something that this current administration is big on. But I think if you can prove that the science is showing that you are reducing kids' risk of joining gangs, of migrating, or I would say, you know, irregular mobilization, then you are doing something to invest in the economy. I think the other thing I would say is continue to look at these economic opportunities at a very local scale. What's happening now, just to close, is there has been a pivot, obviously, with this virus, to take the money from programs, except for mine, because I'm closing, and really shift it into kind of a rapid response. Now, you know, on a good day, our government doesn't know how to manage a crisis, although we have the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance that do. And on a bad day, nobody's ever managed a global crisis. So instead of looking at just doing quick and dirty food and water, soap delivery, let's look at like investing in some more local, very localized economic development. Let's make people understand that people never want to leave their neighborhood. They don't want to leave their city. They like to have access to services, right? And so let's just make sure that those services are fully invested in. And whether you do that with municipal economy or you do that, you know, federally, up to them. I mean, clearly working with the federal government in Honduras has not worked at all. But really investing in those local services. is what I would say. And I probably wouldn't change anything. I might, and I don't want to sound snide, maybe I would dumb down the information. And I just want to end by saying, we have presented to the US government. We have received a number of congressional visits, both Republican and Democrat, mostly Republican. We have met with families and shown them the impact of the families, and they visited the neighborhoods that we all work in. So I think maybe painting the picture and telling them to keep funding. I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but our funding was cut, like 2019 aid was cut. But luckily in the verbiage of US government and development, our money was front loaded, which means it was already in house. So we didn't have to worry about reshifting. But those that had not been front loaded, they were forced with reshifting their direction to look at migration and now to look at COVID. So I think we can't be so responsive. I think it's good to be reactive to some extent, but let us keep doing what we're doing, because investing in both systems and academics and community-based approaches is really going to have a long-term impact. And then the other thing I would say is stop funding me for 3 years. If you really want to look at the long-term impact on these programs, invest in long-term strategies.
Right. Wow. Awesome. One more question, and then we will conclude the program. When you were out in the communities and doing the work, was there any pushback that you received, whether that was from local officials or even just families in general? Was that something that you frequently had to face or not?
Frequently. I mean, I want to frame this by saying, I had a full-time security advisor. And so his job was to, we had GPS trackers on our cars. We had GPS trackers in people's purses and whatever. We did serious security training. On the ground scenario training, like what happens if you get kidnapped? What happens if you're stuck in a house? And, so we take this stuff really seriously. That being said, everywhere we went, our team knew exactly where the scouts were for the gangs. You followed protocol by rolling down your window. We were identified as USAID contractors. We followed all the rules because we were in their territory. And there was blowback from 2 or 3 families during the course of 4 years, partly because they were being threatened by a gang member and they had to leave and they didn't want to continue. And what we try to do if that happens is say, we'll meet you somewhere else and we'll pay for you to come to Pizza Hut or the local chicken parlor, and we'll meet there. And if they're willing to do that, great. But some of them, and then we've even followed them. If they've left, within 100 miles of our program, we followed them to make sure they're okay. We had blowback, certainly from a couple cases of serious abuse that we had to report. We have a very strong protocol for that. And then finally, we had blowback from the gangs. We had a couple times, and let me just finish by saying, when we would take people to the communities, our counselors, they would go with the driver, and the driver's role was to be the eyes and ears of the community, and that person stayed outside in the car. So we had ways of communicating to, code. If things were getting bad in the community, they had to leave, and so there were a couple times when the drivers were confronted by gang members doing initiations, had guns put to their heads. And then when we would say, oh, we're the people that do the family work, they would say, oh, okay, and leave. But, there's a lot of migration and mobilization of gangs that are out of the same network that come from El Salvador, which is only 4 hours away, and come through Honduras to restage and regroup. So oftentimes it's a Salvadoran, oftentimes it's somebody from a different neighborhood that doesn't know what we do. And, I think they're all acknowledging that they don't really want this to repeat in another generation. So blowback, not really. The government loved us. They loved the project. They think, their concept of family is very Christian. And so, our motto is La Familia que hay, no la que hace falta, the family that is, not what's lacking. And so they really valued that as well. And they grew to understand that because obviously most of these families had families that were in gangs because it's a generational thing. We just don't talk about it like that, to the families. So,
right.
So look, normal.
Awesome. Wow, very, very interesting. Okay, well, we haven't seen any other questions come in. Let me just find my my paper really quick to wrap up. So now that we conclude our program, I want to give a big thank you to Robyn Braverman for your wonderful presentation. I also once again thank our sponsors for their generous support, and we thank City Channel 4 for their assistance in making our programs available to viewing audiences. Robyn, thank you for presenting to us today virtually, and to our viewing audience, thank you for joining us. We are adjourned.
Stay safe, wash your hands, and keep your distance.
Well said.